critique of Kant would be a few remarks about the categorical imperative as his test of man's duty. In the first place, there's a real question whether the categorical imperative is very helpful in even testing the genuineness of one's duty. If you stop and think about it, there are a number of things that seem to pass the test of the categorical imperative that we wouldn't feel to be morally obligatory in any sense whatsoever. As far as I can see, there's no absurdity, contradiction, or meaninglessness about saying that everybody in the world is to wear blue socks on Tuesday. You can universalize that maxim without running into any sort of empirical or philosophical difficulty. Well, since the maxim of wearing blue socks on Tuesday passes the categorical imperative, it would seem then that it is our duty, and we must do that duty for duty's sake. We don't ask whether there are consequences which we think are worthwhile. We don't ask about the motivation, the benevolence, the self-interest, or any of these things that might tie in with the duty to wear such socks on Tuesday. It is our duty because it passes the categorical imperative, and that puts an end to it. Anybody who respects the moral law is going to do that. Well, doesn't that seem somewhat arbitrary, indeed downright absurd, to think that just because you can universalize some maxim, that makes it a universal duty? On the other hand, there's another kind of obvious problem with Kant's categorical imperative, and that's that just about anything you want to do can pass the categorical imperative. Even acts that we would, from the outset, reprobate. Let's say that I'm interested in robbing a bank, and I want to act on a maxim and obey Kant's direction to make sure that whatever I do, everybody else would be allowed to do without running into meaninglessness, absurdity, self-contradiction. I need only say that my maxim is somebody with the fingerprints, which I described then as being my own fingerprints, that everybody with those fingerprints, universally, everybody with those fingerprints can rob this particular bank. Now, as it turns out, I've written my maxim not in terms of every man or every human being, but every person with these fingerprints. Now, Kant can't object in any obvious way to that specification, because, after all, we might speak of duties that are on husbands, which are not duties that are on wives, or duties that are on wives that are not on husbands. Duties which are in employers that are not on employees, and vice versa. Sometimes we can specify the subject of our moral maxim as not being the whole human race, but a subclass of the human race. But once you can do that, why can't I make my principle of division fingerprints? And then I universalize that principle, that somebody with such and such fingerprints can rob the bank, and it turns out that allows me to do it. It's perfectly all right, and yet nobody else is going to end up doing it, so there's no self-contradiction or meaninglessness to that. So obviously the categorical imperative makes a duty many things which we would not consider duties, and allows many things which we would not allow. It doesn't seem that it's a very good test at all, after all. Moreover, even if it were a good test of moral maxims, we have the difficulty that the categorical imperative does not supply us the data for ethics or for ethical judgments. The categorical imperative only tests putative claims to moral duty. And you can imagine somebody developing an apple sorting machine. You dump all these apples into the machine, and they're sorted according to size. So the puny apples go down this one chute, and the large, nice, juicy apples go down another. And this apple machine might very well sort the apples the way you want it to, but the apple machine is not going to supply the apples that it sorts. And it turns out that the categorical imperative is just like that apple machine. It will, after you feed into it some various suggestions for man's duty, it will sort out the suggestions as to which are universalizable and which are not. But the categorical imperative doesn't supply the suggestions any more than an apple sorting machine supplies the apples. Consequently, what Kant has given us is not a guide to man's duty, but only a test of one's duty. He doesn't give us any information about what our duties might be, or even what categories we might find our duties. turns out, therefore, that while Kant has an absolutistic, deontological ethic of duty, it is just as abstract as Plato's. You can do just about anything you want once you learn to master the logic of the system. Plato had an absolute good, which didn't give us any concrete direction. Kant has an absolute duty, but that duty can mean just anything you want it to mean. And consequently, Kant is another example of deontologists providing us with moral absolutes without relevance. I think there are other things that could be said about Kant. I want to encourage you to make sure you reread the section on Kant in my book, as well as the section on Kant in the frame syllabus to supplement this. If you're going to understand the key figures in deontological ethics, you really can't learn too much about Plato and Kant, and then finally Intuitionism, which we're going to come to in just a moment. But do you have any questions on Kant before we move on?
This is a curiosity question, but the first three criticisms you gave about universalizing maxims and virtually anything fancy is categorical imperative. It's surprising that Kant wouldn't have thought of that. Is that the case? Is it blindness, or how do you explain it?
The question is, it's really kind of an observation that it's a little disconcerting that Kant wouldn't have thought of such obvious refutation to his theory, being such a notable philosopher. And I think that's a very legitimate thing to wonder about lines of critique that are often given in philosophy. The difficulty is, in this particular case, I can't find anywhere in his writings where he's answered it or protected himself from it either. And my own, this is speculation off the cuff, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but my own feeling is that Kant lived in a day where there was enough of a moral consensus that I don't think he really was worried about supplying us information about our duties. I think he was simply trying to rationally reconstruct what was taken for granted by so many people. Well, you get into a society where there are cynics and skeptics and anarchists and all the rest, and critics such as ourselves who are willing to go to the wall with it and say, well, now what about wearing blue socks on Tuesday? And that may very well be the difference. I wish I had an answer to that question. I don't have anything better. On which one? Well, Kant's been criticized about the categorical imperative. Are you suggesting Hegel suggested that the categorical imperative would allow for anything to be done? Well, that could very well be. I don't know all the ins and outs of all these philosophers, but I don't recall that from my study of Hegel. But, I mean, that could reflect on the deficiency of my study more than anything else. Yes, that could be true, but in answer to this question here, we're thinking specifically of the types of criticism that I'm giving, and I'm just not sure that I can verify that Hegel did. Where did Gordon Clark say this? In Thales to Dewey? Yes, okay. Well, I can try to look that up, but for the sake of our class, I don't have anything more to contribute, I'm afraid. Okay, well, the last great school of deontologism that we want to consider before ending our historical survey, which many of you will have been long enough as it is, I suppose, is the school of Intuitionism, which in the early 20th century is popularized and defended fairly well by G.E. Moore, M-O-O-R-E, G.E. Moore. It is re-expressed by Pritchard, P-R-I-C-H-A-R-D, and then is given its best-known formulation in recent years by W.D. Ross. And I'm going to say a few words separately about Ross before we move on. But first of all, G.E. Moore's Intuitionism. Moore agreed with the utilitarians that good must be something that is beyond us, must be something that is objective to us, and not a quality of a will or a mind, as in Kant, as well as in idealism. He didn't want to say good is just characteristic of man's will. Good has an objective existence. It's a quality that lies beyond our whims and even our volitions. He did agree, nevertheless, with Kant that whatever the good is, it had to be something transcendent. It had to have a unique quality about it because Moore was adamant that you could not derive moral duty or law, the good, from man's finite and empirical experience. Goodness had to be something that went beyond that, had an absolute or sublime quality about it. Okay? And so Moore held that goodness, when all is said and done, is indefinable. Goodness is indefinable. He developed what has come to be called the open question argument about any suggestion in ethics as to what goodness might be. The open question argument. Let's say somebody comes along and suggests that goodness is helping others, benevolence. Moore says, does it make sense to ask whether benevolence is always good? Can you think of a situation where you could say, is benevolence here good? And people wouldn't look at you like somehow you had come from outer space. But you were asking a sensible question. I mean, although it might be obvious to everybody that benevolence is good in that situation, nevertheless, it's worth thinking about. And there's at least the possibility that benevolence wouldn't be good in some circumstance. That's the open question argument against suggestions as to what goodness might be. If it makes sense to ask, is this good? That is, it wouldn't be trivial to answer such a question, then you know that we are not defining goodness by that which is being tested. Somebody says, is pleasure good? Now that makes sense to ask that question. You can imagine some reasons people would offer for saying, no, it's not. However, if pleasure was in fact good, the sole good or the definition of good, it wouldn't make any sense to ask that. That's like, I'll give you an illustration. How would you respond if somebody asked the question, is a bachelor an unmarried male? Now, apart from, you might imagine somebody saying, does the word bachelor mean unmarried male? And that could make sense because in, say, some other language, it might not mean what it means in English. Nevertheless, apart from asking about the word, if somebody says, is a bachelor an unmarried male? Is that bachelor an unmarried male? I mean, those sorts of questions just have trivial answers. Well, of course, that's just what we mean by the word. But you don't have that kind of response that, well, trivially it's true to say goodness is pleasure. Because the open question argument works on such things, in fact, will work on every suggestion as to what goodness might be, G.E. Moore held that goodness was indefinable. There is no definition for goodness. Not only is goodness indefinable, according to G.E. Moore, but it's impossible to derive goodness from any natural state of affairs, any empirical understanding of the world. Consequently, Moore said that goodness was an unnatural quality. Pleasure is a natural quality, and obviously, if you're a hedonist, you believe in a naturalistic view of goodness. But Moore was a non-naturalist when it came to goodness. Goodness is a simple, indefinable, non-natural quality. Moore was led to agree with Hume, therefore, that you cannot derive man's obligation or a moral law from a simple description of what is the case. Prescriptions cannot be based upon descriptions, according to Moore. Is does not lead to ought. And from Moore, we derive the language of naturalistic fallacy. When people try to define what ought to be the case in terms of what is the case, Moore called that the naturalistic fallacy. Okay. So goodness is a non-natural property of various states of affairs. It is simple, that is, it's beyond analyzing. You can't break it down any further. And as simple, it's indefinable. It's like yellow. People can be pointed to yellow, they can be told about yellow, but you can't define yellow. You either know or you don't know because it's a simple quality. Well, how do you know about goodness? I mean, obviously you learn about yellow because somebody says yellow and then points at the right color splotch. And you learn the connection between this word and that simple quality called yellow. How do we learn about goodness? How do we know goodness? To this, Moore said, we learn what goodness is by intuition. We learn what goodness is by intuition. Now, having intuited goodness, everybody just knows that it's wrong to torture young children. And we just intuit that. We know it's wrong to break promises. We intuit these things. And after you learn what goodness is by intuition, then G.E. Moore was something of a quasi-utilitarian. He was a secondary utilitarian, because knowing by intuition what goodness is, then the question is, how do we achieve that goal of goodness, or that ideal of goodness? What are the steps between where we are now to what would be a good state of affairs? And he said that utilitarianism would show us the best means for attaining the good. He was a utilitarian of means, in other words. So a deontologist in terms of his intuitionism, and a utilitarian in terms of his means to that end. So what can we say about G.E. Moore's intuitionism? Well, before I get into some more complicated criticisms, the most obvious thing to say is not everybody intuits uniformly what is good, as Moore suggested. Consequently, you lose either objectivity or universalizability when you take an intuitionist approach to ethics. When people in English society began to write things that didn't fit in with the mores of all good Englishmen, I think here of D.H. Lawrence, for instance, G.E. Moore's intuitionism was in principle killed, because it was clear that some people were not intuiting as G.E. Moore intuited. Well, let's go back and look at some other details, though. How about the idea that goodness is indefinable, because you can always ask the question, is X really good, if you take X to be the definition of what is good? I think G.E. Moore, uncharacteristically here, was engaged in a form of reductionism, forgetting that definitions have many kinds of purposes. If we hold that a definition must reproduce in an exhaustive way all the connotations of a term, then of course goodness would be indefinable. That's because you can't give a definition that will reproduce all the connotations of goodness. But the difficulty is that every other term is indefinable, if that's what you mean by definition, because no definition exhausts the connotation of the word that it defines. Definitions usually give us characteristic marks for the word that we're using, synonyms, a guide to usage. And I think Moore had really too high a view of what a definition had to be when he used his open question technique. Moreover, even when we do have a term that is being properly defined, it sometimes makes sense to ask about the definition and the term being identical. For instance, it makes sense when you're living in a context, or you come into a context where there's confusion over the issue. Let's say somebody has confusion as to whether a billion is the following number of zeros or not. Now you might think, well, there shouldn't be any question about that. A billion simply defined as whatever it is, 1,000 million. And then you find out that, lo and behold, in England, a billion is defined differently than it is in America. And so by asking whether the following number written on a page is a billion or not, a person might very well be asking about some of the mathematical foundations of the society in which he's living, or the circle in which he's speaking about the billion. Definitions, the answer that something that defines something else is identical with it, to say yes to that is not always trivial. Sometimes it's telling you about the presuppositions or assumptions of the universe of discourse. And so the open question argument may not be well suited to distinguish between genuine triviality and just common triviality. Okay, and it also seems clear to me that the open question approach to the indefinability of goodness would hold that if you define something by something else, it's meaningless to call that something else the word that you're using. Let's say I'm defining good by the will of God. Moore seems to assume that, therefore, it would be meaningless to say God's will is good. And if I say goodness means whatever God wills, then I can't turn around and say, and God's will is good, because that wouldn't have any content, it wouldn't have any information to it. Well, I can think of counter-illustrations to that, where it seems to make sense to use an ultimate standard and refer to the ultimate standard as passing the standard of the ultimate standard. Here's one for you. The standard meter, which is in France, as I understand it. The standard meter. We can ask of the standard meter, is it a meter long? And that is the ultimate standard for a meter in Western society, anyway. But it certainly makes sense to ask if it's a meter long. Maybe somebody dropped it on the ground and it chipped a little bit. Maybe there's suspicion that somebody stole the standard meter and replaced it with a fraud last night. So it certainly makes sense to say this standard meter is a meter long. And it would likewise make sense to say God's will is good, even though God's will is the standard of the good. So for all these reasons, the approach Moore took to showing the indefinability of goodness doesn't seem to be a philosophically plausible one. We turn to the next major concept in Moore for a little analysis and criticism, and that's the naturalistic fallacy. What is it that makes good a natural property? What does Moore mean by natural or non-natural? If he says good is a non-natural property, then what is his concept of natural? And we aren't given a whole lot of information on that. And not knowing just exactly what makes something natural, we can also ask, how do you distinguish between the natural and the non-natural? Moore felt that we intuited the difference between a natural and a non-natural quality. The problem with that, however, is that once he shows that good is a non-natural property, that is the foundation for him saying that we must intuit what goodness is. And so what you have is two different people paying each other's bills here, conceptually. But that just won't work. The distinction is supposed to support the intuitive quality of goodness, and yet the distinction is itself supported by an appeal to intuition. So there's something of a roundabout method of reasoning in that. How about the naturalistic fallacy? Is it a fallacy to reason from what is the case to what ought to be the case? Christians don't believe that it always is a fallacy to do so. Because God has made the world in a particular way, and the way God has made the world reveals his moral character. We believe there is a law evident in nature. It's revealed through nature. And somebody could therefore argue, since the following is the case, descriptively about the world, then we ought to live in this way, rather than that. Or how about the character of God? What if we appeal to, why don't we describe God? Describe God as, say, just and merciful. Now that description certainly yields a prescription that his people ought to be just and merciful as well. So there's a case where is does lead to ought. So we have to ask why the naturalistic fallacy is a fallacy according to Moore. And I think what we have to conclude is that it's only a fallacy in some systems of thought, perhaps many systems of thought, let's put it that way. But the naturalistic fallacy is not always a fallacy. It all depends on what metaphysic you are assuming or presupposing. Now let's bring together our remarks about intuition and about the naturalistic fallacy. Moore says that if we're going to discover whether something is good or bad, we need to hold it before our minds, contemplate it, and we will intuit its moral worth, its moral character. And we can ask, what kind of experience is that, this contemplation? Let's say I think about torturing little children. And I say, on the basis of my contemplation of that, I intuit that that's wicked. Now that's a form of experience, isn't it? You notice that I didn't step outside my body and outside the spatio-temporal realm. I didn't stop being the sort of person I am. I used my mind, my senses, my imagination, my memory. That was a form of human experience. Now if I say it is wrong to torture little children on the basis of this experience of contemplation and coming to a conclusion that it's wrong, am I not basing my view of human duty on an experience. And isn't that the very thing that the intuitionists and the deontologists tell us not to do? You can't base duty on an understanding of experience or some kind of experience, yet intuition is, in fact, a kind of experience. Well, one more remark, and then I want to move on to W.D. Ross, so we have some understanding of improvement in Moore's system. Moore says that we intuit these absolute standards of good and duty. Quite clearly, that puts an end to any rational or philosophical ethic, because once things degenerate to the point of intuition, they're not publicly discussable. And you can't have a debate over intuition. You can just say, well, I do or I don't see it that way. It's kind of like looking at a picture. Some people apparently have the artistic sensitivity to see beauty in this picture, and some people just don't have any feel for it at all. I use the word feel here very broadly, I suppose metaphorically. Some people just don't intuit things either. There are some people who are very sensitive to human needs, and they have, well, how can we put it quantitatively? They have a lot more by way of ethical intuitions than other people. Now, are they being legalistic and telling us duties which aren't really duty just because they're so sensitive? Or is the other person just being dull and just not, letting what is there in reality come through to them? They just don't have, quote, a feel for what is right and wrong. Well, it's not just that people disagree then as to duty, but people have varying levels of sensitivity to what is being intuited. And one has to know then who we're going to trust. But if there's no public discussion available, then it seems every man ends up doing what he wants to do. Because if I have to choose between your intuition and your intuition, and there's no way to debate them, I'm going to naturally gravitate toward the one that I'm inclined to want to be true. Another problem with these intuitive duties is that Moore didn't seem to have any way of reconciling conflict between duties. And let's say I intuit the obligation to tell the truth under all circumstances. That is, let's say that I intuit what Kant told me I could find out through the categorical imperative. I must always tell the truth. However, I also intuit that I shouldn't help people kill innocent individuals. I shouldn't be engaged in complicity with respect to murder. All right, and then you have your standard conflict situation. The Gestapo come to the door, want to know if you're hiding innocent Jews that they want to kill. Now, I've intuited that I'm not to tell lies, but I've also intuited that I'm not supposed to sacrifice innocent human life by helping people murder the innocent. Well, how do I reconcile these? The intuitionist, since he doesn't know how he gets to his duties to begin with, doesn't know how to reconcile the conflict between his duties either. And it's just at that point that the British moralist William David Ross, W.D. Ross, seemed to have improved on Moore's intuitionism. Just a little bit of background on Ross, since most people who don't study philosophy professionally don't know much about him. He is perhaps, I won't say he is perhaps one of the most notable philosophers of the century, because there's no question that he's one of the most notable. I'm not sure just exactly where he would stand, but it's very, very high in the esteem of 20th century philosophers. He was a British Aristotelian scholar who was prominent not only in academic life at a number of the university colleges connected with Oxford, but also in public life. In fact, in 1938, he was knighted in Britain and played an important role on certain committees, tribunals at the time of the Second World War, a man who became famous for his practical wisdom and his judicious approach to issues. Now, I said he was an Aristotelian scholar. He's known for his commentaries on Aristotle. He was the editor of the major translation of Aristotle's work in our own particular century. But his main contribution to philosophy, apart from being a scholar of ancient philosophers, was in the field of ethics. In his 1930 publication, The Right and the Good, Ross argued the case for intuitionism with a lucidity and a thoroughness that made the book one of the classics of 20th century ethical writing. Indeed, for about either. And it's just at that point that the British moralist William David Ross, W.D. Ross, seemed to have improved on Moore's intuitionism. just a little bit of background on Ross, since most people who don't study philosophy professionally don't know much about him. He is perhaps, I won't say he is perhaps one of the most notable philosophers of the century, because there's no question that he's one of the most notable. I'm not sure just exactly where he would stand, but it's very, very high in the esteem of 20th century philosophers. He was a British Aristotelian scholar who was prominent not only in academic life at a number of the university colleges connected with Oxford, but also in public life. In fact, in 1938, he was knighted in Britain and played an important role on certain committees, tribunals at the time of the Second World War, a man who became famous for his practical wisdom and his judicious approach to issues. Now, I said he was an Aristotelian scholar. He's known for his commentaries on Aristotle, but he was the editor of the major translation of Aristotle's work in our own particular century. But his main contribution to philosophy, apart from being a scholar of ancient philosophers, was in the field of ethics. In his 1930 publication, The Right and the Good, Ross argued the case for intuitionism with a lucidity and a thoroughness that made the book one of the classics of 20th century ethical writing. Indeed, for about 10 years there, in the 1930s, his book was the center of ethical controversy in the English-speaking world. In 1939, he restated his case and added a reply to his critics in the book Foundations of Ethics. So Ross is known then for the two books, The Right and the Good, and then his other book, The Foundations of Ethics. From Cook Wilson, John Cook Wilson, Ross had learned to oppose all forms of reductionism, the philosophical tendency to reduce one thing to another and thereby oversimplify problems. And from G.E. Moore, he had learned to hate ethical subjectivism. And so Ross didn't want to be reductionistic, and he didn't want to be subjectivistic. Okay, so then when he came to the question of ethics, right and good were for him distinct, indefinable, and irreducibly objective qualities. Distinct, indefinable, and irreducible objective qualities. Now, it's from Ross that we draw, especially in our lifetime, the distinction between rightness and goodness. Rightness, he held, belongs to acts independently of motives, and goodness belongs to motives or personalistic qualities apart from acts. There are four kinds of good things, said Ross: virtue, knowledge, pleasure, as well as the allocation of pleasure and pain according to desert. Okay, so I'll just call that deserting. If you give things their proper desert, respond with the proper desert, then that is what I will mean by deserting. There are four good things: virtue, knowledge, pleasure, and deserting, giving things according to desert. Now, in his two famous books, the targets for his criticism, as I've said, were ethical subjectivism and, on the other hand, ideal utilitarianism. Although G.E. Moore had supported a form of utilitarianism, Ross felt that it was indefensible. The specific duties that lie upon men are of three kinds, said Ross. They are the duties of reparation, gratitude, and keeping faith. The duties of reparation, gratitude, and keeping faith. The plain man, in deciding what he ought to do, said Ross, thinks as often of the past as he does of future consequences. The plain man says, I have a duty to do something because of something in the past, a promise that is made, a debt that has been incurred. Now, what happens when a man intuits two duties which seem to conflict with each other? He is disposed of Moore's utilitarianism by saying that our duties look to the past as much as they do to the future. Then how does he deal with the problem that Moore couldn't deal with, that is the conflict of duties? Well, that naturally is one of the problems that will face any intuitionist, Ross said. And so he argued that when you have a conflict of duties, you should do whichever act is more of a duty. Do the more dutiful duty, which may sound a little bit like some animals being more equal than others in light of a deontological understanding of moral obligation. But Ross did go on to make some sense of this. He says, do whichever act is more of a duty, and to make sense of that phrase, more of a duty, he drew a distinction between what he called prima facie duties and actual duties. Prima facie duties and actual duties. There are two levels of duties then, prima facie and actual. And he held that a conflict can only arise between prima facie duties. No conflict can arise between actual duties. Conflicts can only arise between prima facie duties. An act is a prima facie or a conditional duty by virtue of being of a certain kind. For instance, an act, if it belongs to the category of repaying a debt, would be a conditional or prima facie duty. And that would be an actual duty if it were not also of some other morally important kind or did not conflict with another more important prima facie duty. And thus, if I have promised to lend money to a friend who is in need, I have a prima facie duty to hand over the money. But suppose that before I hand over the money, I find that my mother is in the hospital and is in need of that money for crucial medical treatment. So now I will recognize a conflicting prima facie duty. On the one hand, I have the duty to pay off my debt to my friend. On the other hand, to support my mother who is ill and in the hospital. Now, in such a situation as that, Ross maintained that one and only one of those two prima facie duties is actually my duty. You see the disdain for ethical subjectivism? He doesn't say, well, when it's, a situation of conflict, everything's up for grabs. He says, no, as a matter of fact, one of those is your actual duty, and the other one's only a prima facie duty. Secondly, he said, I know each of these is a prima facie duty. That's rather self-evident, because I feel just intuitively I ought to pay off my debt, but I also ought to support my sick mother. So both of these are prima facie, but only one of them can be in my actual duty. And thus far, this distinction between prima facie and actual duties seems to be helpful, and many people have been enamored of it, who have been enamored of a deontological and intuitionist approach to ethics. But I think the third step in Ross's approach to the conflict of duties situation is the one that, from our standpoint, will make it utterly unacceptable. Ross concluded, I can have only an opinion about which is more of a duty, and therefore my actual duty. So you see, here's another case of a deontologist that seems to have the formal relations of ethics all worked out. Conflict of duty, obviously they're both prima facie my duty, but only one of them can really be my actual duty. And we won't buy in with subjectivism that says, well, you can just arbitrarily choose. He says you can't arbitrarily choose, but he does say you can only have an opinion as to which one is your actual duty. So there you have intuitionism leading, in the end, to a form of skepticism. We just can't know for sure. Now we know, because we intuit, we have certainty about our duties, but when it comes to a conflict of duty, all we have is opinion. We lose our certainty. So what we have been looking at here is the history of deontological theories and the failure to come up with a theory of duty. We've surveyed pagan cosmic law. We've looked at the pre-Socratics from Thales, the Milesians, through the Heracliteans, Eleatics, the pluralists, the Pythagoreans, the sophists, and then finally we come, after all that development, to a classic illustration, clear expression of deontologism in Plato. Okay, then we looked at some middle deontologists between Plato and Kant, the Cynics and Stoics as something of a merged school of thought, the Neoplatonist, Leibniz as a rationalist, Hobbes and Locke and Butler as empiricist, Butler being specifically somebody who appealed to conscience to find man's duty, Then we've looked at Kant, the rational approach to deontologism, categorical imperative, and then finally G.E. Moore and W.D. Ross as intuitionists. Now, through this history of deontologism, there are, it seems to me, four basic motifs that keep reoccurring. There may be more, but these just really stand out. And so if you can master the criticism of these motifs, I think you'll be able to handle anything that comes down the pike that is of a school of thought that's of deontological nature. And those four basic motifs that I would rehearse for you is, first of all, the no distinction motif. The no distinction motif. There are plenty of schools of thought that hold to certainty, rational insight, the unity of all things, universalizability, all these rather stable qualities in a philosophical system, but which hold that in the end, ultimate reality or final reality knows no distinction between individuals or particulars or good and evil. Obviously, the Eastern mystics, Parmenides, and Plotinus are leading illustrations of that motif, that there is ultimately no distinction between good and evil. We have an absolute duty, but there is no distinction between good and evil. Another motif is the appeal to reason to find one's duty, and you see this in Heraclitus, Epicurus, Plato, and Kant, the appeal to reason. In fact, as I said before, just about all of the early Greek ethical theories reduced to live reasonably, live according to reason. All right, and there are others who say that we learn what our duty is in terms of natural law. Natural law. You have Protagoras, the Stoics, and Hobbes, and to some degree Locke as well. The natural law of self-preservation is especially the leading candidate here. The motif of appealing to self-preservation or the natural processes and our duty to emulate them. And then finally, you have the appeals that we've seen already to intuition. Plato's appeal to recollection, Butler's appeal to conscience, and G.E. Moore and W.D. Ross appealing to intuition itself. So the motifs in the history of deontologism that you want to master, there's no distinction between particulars, between the particulars good and evil. The appeal to reason, the appeal to natural law, the appeal to intuition to give us our duty. Obviously, the alternative that's missing here that we're going to go on to is one that begins not with the idea of monism, there's no distinction, but is a dualistic approach to reality and to ethics, dualism between creator and creature. And the way that we learn about our absolute duties is not through reason, intuition, or natural law, but rather through the Creator's self-revelation. Now, before I get off the history of deontologism, I do want to make a note about quasi-deontologist. Quasi-deontologist. Remember that earlier in our lectures today, I noted the characteristics of deontological ethics. Deontological ethics is typically an ethics that says regardless of the consequences, we have to do our duty, regardless of what's going to happen, what the outcome is. Deontological ethics says self-sacrifice must be possible in any genuine ethical system. Obligation is not derived from an understanding of my wants or my whims or my empirical experience. My duties must be authoritative and binding, universally binding. Well, from that standpoint, there are people in the history of philosophy who have tried to emulate the characteristics of deontological ethics that deserve mention. And in my outline, I'm simply going to call them quasi-deontologists. The first would be Epicurus. Now, we've already criticized Epicurus in a previous course, our teleological course, because Epicurus said we should all seek pleasure. However, Epicurus was quite clear that it was a universal duty to seek pleasure. And he wanted to hold, as a cognitivist, what we would now call a cognitivist, that the meaning of the term good or value was a natural quality and that it was objectively existent. Pleasure is out there, and it's an objective duty to seek it. So although he was a teleologist, he did try to incorporate some elements of a deontological approach or commitment to duty. Another example of quasi-deontologists would be the natural law advocates throughout history. And you would see that, of course, from the fact that I've mentioned at least one school of natural law theorizing, the Stoics. Natural law advocates have often held to the universal qualities of duty, that duty can lead to self-sacrifice, and that duty is not always based upon what I want or on what the consequences are going to be. However, for the natural law theorist, it is based upon the nature of the situation and my empirical evaluation of reality. So you have Epicurus, the natural law advocates, and then in our own day, I think the more fascinating illustration of quasi-deontologism would be rule utilitarianism and rule egoism. Both the utilitarians and the egoists have suffered from the critiques made of their teleological approach to goodness or to ethics, to duty. Obviously, if it's my duty to pursue the greatest good for the greatest number or my own individual good, you can imagine scenarios where I'm led to do things which are just counterintuitive, that prima facie ought not to be done. Killing the innocent, for instance. As long as you get away with it and you receive more benefit, or the society receives more benefit than the pain received by the innocent man who was killed. To answer this and many other defects in their teleological systems, many utilitarians and egoists have modified their teleologism to hold that what the teleological test actually tests is rules rather than concrete actions. So let's say I'm contemplating robbing a bank. Act utilitarianism would say, I consider that one individual act in its context, consider the consequences of that act in that context, and decide whether a favorable balance of good or pleasure over pain is going to be realized. If it is, then that act is all right. The rule utilitarian says you don't use utilitarianism to judge individual acts. You use utilitarianism to judge rules. And then once you've got your rules, everybody must follow the rules. Then it's very deontological, you see. It's universal duty from that point on. And you don't make exceptions for yourself and for others on the basis that, well, in this case, this particular act will maximize happiness, although as a general rule it wouldn't. You can't make exceptions. Then you become duty for duty's sake. Very Kantian, if you will, in your approach to ethics. The utilitarianism aspect of rule utilitarianism is that we decide which rules are going to lead to the welfare of society. Would it be better to have a society where lying is countenanced and approved, or a society where lying is punished? Okay, now once we decide which of those rules is the better rule, now everybody must follow it. And we would say if you break the rule, then you're guilty, even if, in that particular case, breaking the rule would have maximized happiness over pain. And so rule utilitarianism and rule egoism are what I will call generally now rule consequentialism. That is, choosing rules on the basis of consequences that can be anticipated for the rules. Rule consequentialism is another quasi-deontological approach to ethics. It's an attempt to bring together both deontologism and consequentialism. What did the quasi-deontologist teach us? My concluding commentary today is that the quasi-deontologists show us that you can't have one perspective on ethics, that is, motivationalism or the motivationalist approach, the personalist approach, or the teleological consequentialist approach, or the normative deontological approach, all by themselves. It's impossible to have an ethic. One of those angles on the triangle, to use that illustration from the syllabus, it's impossible to have just one of those angles be adequate in itself. And so we do see in the unbelieving world minimal attempts being made, perhaps not entirely successful, but nevertheless attempts being made to merge some of these perspectives, to try to bring them together. I don't believe the attempt will be successful until revelation from the Creator is accepted as the foundation of ethics. But nevertheless, we do see testimony to the truth in these, even if they are futile, efforts by the quasi-deontologist. Do you have any questions you want to ask before we end today's session? Yes. Okay, the question has to do with some bibliography on deontological ethics, an ethic of duty. I'm trying to think in my own library whether there's one book that just focuses on the deontologists themselves. Usually, what you'll have to do in a case having to do with the history of ethics is you'll take a book that deals with the history of ethics or different types of ethical theories. Like C.D. Broad has written a famous book, 5 Types of Ethical Theory, or 2 well-known histories of ethics, Sidgwick's earlier book, from the earlier part of this century, toward the turn of the century, outlines the system of ethics, or McIntyre's book, A Short History of Ethics. You can take books of that nature and, knowing who the deontologists are, pursue the relevant chapters. And so some history is available, but I'm not aware of any particular book that pursues only the ethic of duty. Because as you can see, you find it in different schools of thought. It's somewhat in the Stoics, it's somewhat in the conscience school of Butler, it's the Platonists, the Kantians, the Intuitionists, and for that reason, there doesn't seem to be any, I'm not going to say it, simple way or any clear pattern of deontologism in history. It's not as though all the rationalists are deontologists, and therefore any book on the history of rationalism is going to have a chapter then on rationalist ethics. There's great variation among the schools of thought that endorse deontologism. But if I do think of one, I will let you know. Now, what I want to do tomorrow when we begin is then take up some of the main apologetical questions that pertain to deontological ethics. These would be parallel to our discussion of moral responsibility, the whole question of determinism and free will that we studied when we were looking at personalistic or motivational ethics, the question of ethical relativism when we were studying teleological ethics, and then we're going to be looking at some parallel questions of deontological nature tomorrow when we begin. After we do that, then I'm going to step back and look at all 3 of our courses on ethics and try to make some general remarks about meta-ethics. Try to wrap up the apologetics of ethics by uniting the critiques from all the courses, and then we'll move on into a positive exposition of the deontological perspective of God's law. Thank you.